I was writing yet another funding application when I came across this famous question: how will you study sex and gender? It made me spiral into all these different questions, like what is sex? What is gender? What is the difference? Do they matter in research, and will they even yield different results? So, for the very first Cuban podcast, join me on this exploration of sex and gender in the field of neurosciences and neuroimaging. With me today, I have Dr. Buckley, Assistant Professor of Neurology at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and Dr. Flatt, Assistant Professor in the Social and Behavioral Health Program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
All right. Well, I can start if that's helpful. So my name is Dr. Rachel Buckley. I'm based at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I'm an assistant professor of neurology. I actually am from Australia originally. I trained at the University of Melbourne, and I have been working now for more than a decade on trying to predict preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So trying to detect the earliest signs of the disease, the pathology, as well as the cognitive changes that can occur very, very early. And my work specifically focuses on sex differences, so a biological standpoint, and focus on why it might be particularly that women stand to be at greater risk of Alzheimer's disease. And I focus very much on PET neuroimaging and MRI. And I also am very, very passionate about longitudinal statistical modeling and data harmonization. So I strongly believe in trying to put together as many cohorts as possible to increase diversity, to give myself the power, statistical power, to look at some of these questions that I'm interested in. And I have a very strong interest in sex hormones at the moment, hormone therapy, and what the impact might be of hormone therapy on the biology of the disease. And I'm also starting to get a little bit interested in the X chromosome specifically as well. But genetics is not necessarily my area of expertise. So I have a very big collaborative network where I rely a lot on my colleagues to do a lot of this multidisciplinary research. And as a little plug, for anyone who is interested in more information, I am also part of the Sex and Gender Differences in Alzheimer's Disease professional interest area. That is hosted by the Alzheimer's Association, and I'm the vice chair of that professional group. And the chair is Dr. Timothy Homan from Vanderbilt University. And if anybody is interested in hearing more about the professional interest area, please do reach out. And my Twitter handle is at BUCKLR01. So you can find me on Twitter as well. Jason, over to you.
Awesome.
Add to that you're a singer.
Oh, okay. So I wasn't going to say that, but yes, I have also sung about estrogen on Twitter.
Amazing performance. Loved it. Sorry.
All right, Jason.
Yeah. So I'm Jason Flatt, and I use he and they as my pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor. I'm at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in their School of Public Health, in their Department of Social and Behavioral Health. My research area has really been focused on LGBTQIA plus people who are living with Alzheimer's disease, maybe at risk for Alzheimer's disease. I do a little work in Parkinson's disease as well. And then much of my work, kind of what's informed this, I sort of come to brain aging or the space with sort of like a focusing on like the psychosocial aspects. So that's really a perspective I come from. I use a range of different methods. So do some epi work. I use medical record data to look at risk. I collect data through quantitative or qualitative methods, really trying to capture some of the things we've talked about around how people navigate the environment, how stress gets under the skin and impacts the body, especially around things like discrimination. And then a passion area that I've been doing is working with quite a few scholars that are focused more on gender and specifically thinking about like transgender health and aging and cognitive aging. Right now, I'm co-chair for a LGBTQIA plus interest group that's also a part of the Alzheimer's Association. So I do that work, and I sit on a few, like there's a diversity and disparities PIA that I'm a part of. So yeah, and doing one of the things we're doing right now, we have a grant that's called the RISE Registry, Research Inclusion Supports Equity, and it's one of the first efforts to recruit LGBTQIA plus people into research. So the riseregistry.org is where you could go to find out more about it. I'm also on Twitter, but I do not sing on there, and it's Jason D. Flat.
Are people going to give us a different answer if we ask about gender because the generation is so different? And I get the feeling that gender is a very new topic in the way that we think about it nowadays. So it's something that I wonder quite often, because gender is important to consider in research, but it makes me wonder with older adults, what is the best way to do it in a way that is not like, how do you feel, men or women? You know what I mean?
I think it's to follow some of the best practices. We know that there are LGBTQIA plus older people that are participating in research and often we weren't even aware because we didn't ask, the right questions. I think, right, we could take a perspective of like, even I shared how my gender identity is evolving, and I would say we could see that it could continue to evolve even when you're in late life, right? We see, for instance, many people that are, maybe a gender minority or transgender, and it isn't until maybe they have the protections in life or the independence and other circumstances that they're able to even endorse and the identities that they've held for a very long time, right? And I think specifically for some older adults who don't kind of come out as transgender or non-binary until later in life, and there's many different reasons for that. It's not just like one. And so I tell many people, even though we're working with older populations that maybe we think that identity is more formed or like it's like solid and they might get offended by questions, it's actually not the case. We're seeing, identity evolves over the life course. So yeah.
And I guess more something that was very fascinating to me recently, and this is unpublished evidence, but I had been speaking with some researchers who were looking at a census level amount of data collected on gender identity, and they were trying to associate it with dementia risk using population level surveys based in the United States, so only United States data. But the thing that I found fascinating about that, because I was sort of unclear at a population level to what extent older adults might assume certain identities or be willing to speak about these things, even just as census data. What would they be comfortable revealing about themselves or ticking off in a survey? And in fact, there was quite a significant minority of individuals who associated themselves with not necessarily. I think I can't exactly. The reason I'm a little unsure about how to respond to this is I can't remember exactly what the survey was asking. But they had male, female, and then other identities listed, and it was very interesting to me that there are actually quite a lot of older adults who will actually specify something other than simply male or female, and it was a much higher frequency than I would have necessarily assumed myself in the general population. And it definitely says to me that we are not capturing that data. We're not capturing it well currently in any of the observational studies that we tend to focus the most on that are relevant, for instance, in our area, which is Alzheimer's disease research. And so there is a healthy minority of individuals who are being looked over that could be better served by observational research at the moment. That's my take, I think. And I would absolutely think Jason would have better perspectives on this, but that's something that I took away. And I hope that paper will get published sometime soon.
Amazing. Yeah, we need examples like that to come out.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say in many of the national studies, we would, right? The issue is about there's a bias in aging research, in working with older populations. And I think you started with this of like, they won't know what that question is, or that's going to make people uncomfortable, or they're not going to want to answer that. Or like you're saying, like, is this even a valid measure? Will we get a true, accurate response in terms of people's identities? And so we are seeing that. You will, if you actually ask it. And we looked at like one example, we were looking at and I don't know about other studies that have like the biological data. I'm a social behavioral scientist, so I'm not as attuned with studies that are getting like genetics, right? Or having that. But what we saw in the UK Biobank, actually, right? So just looking at one that we had information on chromosomes and looking at identities, and there was a lot of discordance, right? In terms of, I mean, it wasn't huge, but it was around like 2 to 3% of people, right? The identity they were listing was not in line with the chromosomal data that they had in the study, right? And so right there, it was showing like you're not asking in a right way, so you're not actually getting people's true identity. And this is even the issue around, right? We struggle with the terms around sex and gender. Well, so do the participants that are filling out these surveys or answering questions. It's not clear to them when you're asking and you just ask, are you male or female? You don't give them any caveat of like, is this your, sex assigned at birth? Is this related to, your genetics or your chromosomes, right? Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking about my gender? And so what we find for many people, when you just ask a question and there's no context, you're going to get probably gender, would be my guess, right? But we actually don't know. You might get sex, biological sex, or you might get gender, or you might get a mix of both. And so that's what we're seeing in studies, is this concept is also confusing to our participants. And we're not being clear and explicit about what exactly we're asking.
That's a very good point, especially considering that, especially like because we talk about Alzheimer's, we have a definition that's quite specific for dementia and for everything. When it comes to sex and gender, like I feel like we don't have a concept that we pin down for the whole field to use, so we don't really know what different people are measuring. And I think that's quite incredible that we don't have a definition for something so important that we keep seeing that has an impact on so many different things.
Mm-hmm. And we looked at that. We did look at this in so a colleague of mine, Shana Stites, and I surveyed as many of the Alzheimer's disease research centers and groups that are doing Alzheimer's research to ask, how do you measure sex? Mm-hmm. How do you measure gender? And basically across all the studies, no one explicitly had a definition. They couldn't tell you what the variable was. And in some studies, they're still ascertaining sex based on visual. Mm-hmm. Like the interviewer perceives mm-hmm. the person's sex, or sometimes it's vocal timbre, like on the phone, and
sounded male.
Yeah, and it's like, are you kidding me? Are you
Mm-hmm.
kidding me? Right? I have
Mm-hmm.
some gay friends. I have one friend that sounds like an older woman when you talk to him, right? He is definitely a cisgender man. Right? And so
Yep.
you can see this error that's introduced into our research when you don't have clear protocols of how you.
Yeah. And it's because of these archaic ways that we just compartmentalize things in the past due to whatever systemic and structural ways that we just assume things to be simplistic. Even the way we see sex differences research still persist. So, for instance, I'll say to somebody, "Oh, I'm really interested in looking at this particular variable in association with sex differences," and someone will go, "Oh, I already covariate for sex. Nothing there. Nothing there. Don't worry." So just even those opinions are very prevalent within, and I wouldn't just say it's Alzheimer's disease research. I think there is still a very healthy number of people in the world, not even in academia, who see things in a certain very simple black and white way that seems very clear and has probably lasted for decades. And things are changing, but it is a slow process to get to. So another example, which to me just dumbfounds me. So one thing that I'm very fascinated by in particular is women's health in association with Alzheimer's disease risk specifically. And you would be shocked by the amount of data sets that do not capture anything in these older adult data sets on age at menopause. Nothing. There's basically nothing. All you might get is something on hormone therapy use, but that's because it's a part of the medication history. It's not because they asked it specifically. You may or may not hear about history of hysterectomy or ovarectomy, so removal of the ovaries, but you'll never get any information about age at menopause, menopause symptomatology, age at first menses, use of oral contraceptives in the past. And half of the data sets, if not more, usually a majority of the individuals who will be in observational studies will be women. And so there is a significant lack of thought put into thinking about gender and sex and reproductive health, which I find fascinating and a little bit shocking. And I hope that these things will change with time.
Mhm.
I'm by nature very optimistic. So like by nature, that's how I am. And I keep seeing like grants asking for that information more and more, and even scholarships and awards. So I am very, very hopeful that we're going to start to take it more into account and not just control for it, which, by the way, I thought that was the way to do it. But now I learned that there are so many different ways to account for sex that are so much better than just being like, you know what, in my model, I put it in there and that's it. It's a lot more important than that, which is going to bring me to, I think, a very difficult question. Do you think you could define, maybe in your own words, sex and gender, and the importance of studying them both? How do you think that has changed throughout history? So there's kind of like three questions there. So sex and gender, how do we define them? How has that changed throughout history, and why should we look at them both? I think my accent is really why both of them, like what's the different information they can give us?
So and this has evolved right in how I interpret. So I look at sex as more of a biological measure. So as I mentioned before, that's sort of the sex that was assigned to someone at birth based on their, and this is still an issue, right? Most of the time, the way your sex is assigned when you're born is they look at your genitalia, right? Maybe nowadays they're running more tests in terms of genetics so they can actually look at chromosomes or, and know for sure. But much of it, I don't even know if that's not common practice, right? It's usually a visual inspection when the baby's born and they assign you male or female, right? We actually know that like 2% of the population doesn't even fall into one of those binaries. So there are intersex people that are born with differences in their sex development, right? So that could be their anatomy, their chromosomes, how their body responds to hormones. So that's how I define sex, is sort of more around the biology and what sort of our communities perceive based on that biology. We assign you, male or female, maybe intersex. And then for gender, I view that as sort of it's very complex. It has sort of this notion of individuals and how they perceive themselves, right, in terms of their identity and their expression. But we can't take that outside of like the cultural and social influences that also shape how people perceive themselves. So they're sort of perceiving themselves within a world of others. And do I perceive myself as a woman or as a man or as, a non-binary person or a transgender person? How do I perceive sort of my identity within these systems in which we navigate socially? And then how do I also choose to express that to others or within myself or to people that I'm close to, right? And sort of how I express my identity in terms of, is it masculine? Is it feminine? Is it more in a gender queer non-binary way, right? And sort of, and it's shaped by all those influences over time, and that's why it evolves. So that's how I would define them.
I think that is so nicely put, Jason. And all I would say is, slightly adding to that would be that because my focus is primarily on sex differences. And when I think about sex differences, it is definitely sex assigned at birth. So I'm thinking about the biological aspects. Primarily, I'm interested in what within the body is potentially having an impact on pathology in particular, or cognitive decline, changes in cognition over time that might be associated with Alzheimer's disease. And I'm thinking not just, this particular participant said, I am female, for instance, but I'm also interested in sex hormone levels. Are levels of estradiol or levels of progesterone or estrone or whatever I might have, or testosterone in men or women, are they associated with higher or lower levels of pathology based on neuroimaging? And we know that sex hormones from both sides can exist in men and women at differing dynamic ranges, but in a sex-specific manner. So in women, estradiol may have these effects, but in men, estradiol may have different effects. And so that's one thing that I'm very interested in. Another is more sort of broad-ranging measures, proxies of reproductive health. So age at menopause. Earlier age at menopause indicates, less estrogen exposure in life, which we generally tend to associate with higher risk. Estrogen is largely seen as protective, except if you're thinking of hormone therapy introduction, which is actually associated with higher risk. But there's lots of these interplays of the hormonal components that I'm very interested in. There's also very interesting data on testosterone, which may have more potent associations with AD pathology, it seems, that the latest literature that seems to be coming out. But the other side of the coin for the biological component is the X chromosome. And there are I could talk for ages on this and I won't, but there's lots of very interesting data on the X chromosome that's really starting to come out lately. A lot of Dina Jubal's work that looks at the idea of women having two X chromosomes is a good thing. And it builds resilience, in fact, for women against AD risk. And there are some really amazing reasons for why, and we could talk about that another time. But those are the sort of things, when I'm talking about sex, I'm thinking about the biology specifically. But in extension to what Jason was talking about with the gender, one thing that has often come up in my mind, in relation to gender as well, is some of the systemic issues that women faced, even historically. So access to occupation, just even working, right? Women may not have been encouraged to continue education in the past. In these birth cohorts that are now very relevant and very high risk for dementia, they are now starting to look at that, the critical ages of 70 to 80 years old. That was back in the time when a lot of them were being, told, oh, don't go to medical school. What are you going to do with a medical degree? Go to secretary school. I mean, that was one of my aunts, was she declined medical school to go to secretary school.
You need to find a husband. You're not going to find a husband if you go to
exactly.
medical school.
There's all these sort of social structures. So not just identity and those, and let's just say as well, it's identity, but also the stigma that can be associated with the identity. And in fact, some of the work that I was talking about that's unpublished still, and I hope that it will be coming out soon, it really talked about this idea of how stigma currently, when thinking about things like transgender and identity and things like that, but also stigma associated with how women had to sort of make their way through the workforce when it was still considered to be, having to break glass ceilings and all sorts of things. Like, there's all these social and cultural structures in place that make gender a very, very present and real part of all of this work. And it is very difficult, nigh on impossible, to pull these two things apart. Then on top of that, we have other issues, I think, that are sex and gender associated, that are sort of collateral. They're sort of collider bias issues. So, for instance, men have very differing levels of vascular risk than women, just simply because of the way that they live. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to drink more alcohol. They just have very different lifestyles, at least historically, than women, and so have very different sort of risk levels in association with other things. So that also plays a role, thinking about other levels of risk. And so I think a lot of these things play a part, and it is imperative that we think about as much of these facets as we can when we're thinking about risk and modeling sex differences and gender differences.
We typically, for measuring, like, at least when we're trying to get at this, we ask sex assigned at birth, right? So it's explicit what sex were you assigned at birth, male, female. We're going to be adding like an intersex option, but we know for the older cohorts that we're working with that it wasn't an option. That's something new, right? That just came in the past couple of years. So there's likely no way that they could have been assigned intersex. But that's an option. And then we ask about gender identity and allow for a range of expressions. So we keep like man, woman, but we also do like transgender woman, transgender man, right? Non-binary, as well as write-in options. And so a big challenge is also getting, people may not endorse some of these identities still, right? And what we're finding, for instance, is even among transgender people, that they may not endorse a transgender identity, right? That's just, they're like, I'm a woman. That's who I am. I'm a woman. Why do I need to say that I'm a transgender woman? That part doesn't matter. And so that kind of can be a piece of it. Right now, we're still trying to allow people to endorse that. But we are finding that many people just endorse, man or woman or non-binary, and don't necessarily endorse a transgender identity. But that seems to be, and that's what we've recommended. Actually, the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center has a new version of their uniform data set, like UDS, that's coming out, and it's going to include these measures of sex assigned at birth and gender identity. So I think that is hopefully will be a way at least to represent people in a more open and, a way to, and also to ensure that diverse gender identities that haven't been typically included are now included more.
I do think
Yeah.
it's amazing to offer that space to people to be able to feel included and to be able to feel like, because I think one thing that it's kind of a bummer, but often research is a very like closed environment where it's like men and women and like mostly white people. And I do think that this new trend of like being more inclusive makes people even want to participate more in research and want to understand it because it relates to them, it speaks to them. And I do think, for example, if we look at medicine in the past, it was more like studying men, even though women were also there. Women also want to know about their health. And I think it's amazing to be more inclusive, which makes people want to just be involved in science more, which is an amazing field, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And
then we have to figure out what to do with the data is the challenge, though, right? Of like, how do we look at subgroups, or how do we, there's been that huge issue of like, well, how do we look at the different groups and sort of categorize people, which is still where we're not quite at, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when we start to think at that level, we're talking about statistics, and there's a very fundamental issue that we have when we're trying to predict things or look at differences between things. There's something called power. And power is essentially, do you have the amount of data, that the sample size that you really need to test for this difference and feel confident that if you find something that you had the sample size to do it, the power to do it. And often when you are talking about subgroups such as these, although historically and even now currently you could say the same thing about ethno-racial groups, that a lot of our studies, as you were just saying, are very overrepresented with white participants, right? So you end up with these underpowered studies to look at a lot of different things, not just sex and gender issues. But this is something we really need to target specifically and really try as best as possible to allow people the space to feel comfortable to do this, but also to design our studies a lot better, to focus particularly on these groups.
Again, my optimistic side really, really thinks this is very possible. Really target them, and it's just a question of effort and really wanting to do it and people really getting to it. I think I just think that these populations might not be as accessible, but even that in itself, in my opinion, is a type of inequality, not being able to be part of the sample and things like that. So I do think that we absolutely can do it if we really wanted to.
I agree.
Hey Cuban listeners, right now your brain is probably overflowing with new synaptic connections because of all this new information. So take a small break and check out the Cuban blog at www.rbig/cuban.qc.ca and follow us on Twitter at rbig_Cuban. The Cuban blog is a student-led blog where we explore different scientific topics. Our main goal is to share our love for science by making it open and accessible to everyone through fun and interesting articles. Now let's get back where we left off.
On a brighter note, in your opinion, what is the most interesting measurements related to sex and gender that we have obtained through different research methods, in particular imaging?
It's a very, very good question. I think just like you were mentioning at the beginning of the discussion, there's a lot exploding right now, particularly thinking about sex differences. Gender differences, I still think, has a way to go to do it properly and to do it justice. But in terms of sex differences, in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, there's been a really, really big push, a concerted effort to really tackle looking at sex differences in a lot of different ways for neuroimaging. So, obviously we're focused a lot on Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Jason and I, or other related dementias as well. And we usually tend to focus on positron emission tomography imaging, so PET imaging of amyloid and tau specifically, but there's also other PET traces of things like glucose metabolism, maybe even inflammation. And there's also MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. MRI can give you information about structure, so brain volume or thickness of your cortices, the outer layer of the brain, and other information about cerebrovascular disease, and maybe even structural connectivity, so how white matter tracks are connecting throughout the brain. And then you can also get information about resting state or task-based change. So you might have a memory task in a scanner and you're interested in how activation changes based on your memory of a particular task or the way you perform. And then there's resting state, where you're just lying in a scanner, thinking about nothing in particular, and we're measuring, basically blood oxygen levels and how they correlate throughout a time series in the brain. And what we have focused on in our lab, and actually a lot of different groups have been focusing lately, is in amyloid and tau, specifically the traces. And what we tend to see very overwhelmingly is there doesn't seem to be a very clear sex difference in amyloid levels. So across the board, no studies have really suggested that there are differences. But when you start to look at tau, which is a very interesting protein that has been much more closely associated with cognitive decline and actual progression to dementia, that is when we start to see that women show much higher levels of tau than men. And this is actually not just in PET neuroimaging, this is also in cerebrospinal fluid. And there is some suggestion also maybe in plasma markers of tau, although it's still an emerging area, so we're not entirely certain yet. But there's a very, very interesting potential susceptibility to tau. And I say potential because it could actually be resilience related to what I was saying before. It could just be that men who could potentially be a part of the study have already transitioned to dementia, or they have too much vascular risk and can't be involved in our study. Therefore, it looks like women have higher tau, but in fact, they're very healthy and they're living their lives well with high levels of tau. So there's sort of a double story there. But there's definitely an interesting sex difference going on with. So those are the sorts of sex differences that we see. But there have also been somewhat controversial findings that have come out in, I would say, the past few years using UK Biobank data. I'm thinking of Stuart Ritchie's work, who was looking at just structural and structural connectivity differences between men and women in the UK Biobank, and found that there were differences in the way that the structural connectivity was coming out. So tractography showed that there were more interconnectivity connections for women, but men had slightly thicker cortices in certain areas. There's also findings from the Mayo Clinic, for instance, that suggest that women have a larger hippocampal volume than men. And in fact, there are a couple of other studies that show slightly larger hippocampal volume. Women tend to characteristically perform much better than men in verbal memory. In fact, most neuropsych tasks, they tend to perform a lot better, except some spatial tasks and some tasks that require, like there's one called an executive functioning task called the NBAC task that's somewhat difficult, and sometimes men tend to perform a little bit better on that. But there are some interesting findings, at least in the neuroimaging world, that show that there are some sex differences there. Specifically in association with Alzheimer's disease. There's an emerging story with tau, and now it's a case of trying to figure out what might be driving that. Is that a sex biological association? Is it a gender association? Or is it a survivor bias issue? Or a methodological issue involving neuroimaging, like morphological differences can have an impact on PET neuroimaging. Partial volume correction can have an impact on one very fascinating study that just came out suggested that women have different bone density in the skull, which may be associated with different tracer retention of tau. So all these little things are really important when we're thinking about these sex differences. What are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a biological effect or something?
Yeah, those are very interesting results. I think my favorite type of research where sex and gender are so difficult to distinguish from one another are all the lifestyle factor and modifiable risk factor, which are incredible results. Like when you look at cardiovascular risk, you look at sleep, mindfulness, and all those psychological factors. I think that's where, in my opinion, sex and gender are so difficult to distinguish, because obviously a sex like part to it. Like for example, sleep. How do we know? Maybe there's a brain structure difference that makes women or men sleep better or worse. And then you have the gender component where women have been known to be caregivers and like to have more sleep complaints. For example, after menopause, I think they are more likely to complain about their sleep or things like that. And I think lifestyle factor studies are amazing when it comes to sex and gender. But we often just control for sex though. So maybe we need to either separate them into two groups, like men, women, or do different type of studies. Menopause, and I know you got a paper out recently that's just amazing. Like, great. I love to read it, and I thought it was so interesting. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that when you're talking about things like, I mean, sleep is a perfect example, right? Because menopause is a huge, one of the biggest symptoms, one of the biggest things to change is sleep. Insomnia is a huge issue, and also cognitive symptoms. So brain fog, all sorts of things happen around the age of 50 to 60. These are really, really well documented symptoms, and we don't know whether the brain fog is happening because of what's underlying changing with the estrogen hormone levels changing, whether it's associated with the lack of sleep. There's so many things that we don't still fully understand. There's also vasomotor symptoms. I mean, some women go through such severe symptoms that the only thing that can really treat it is hormone therapy. But we know that hormone therapy is a risk for a few things. So it's, there's a lot to unpack when you're thinking about lifestyle. Certainly, as we've talked about, diet, alcohol use, smoking even, although smoking is on a significant decline now. So it won't be as much of an issue in future generations, but still at the generations we're interested in terms of dementia risk, that's a huge issue, and that's definitely sex biased. But Jason, what are your thoughts as well on lifestyle factors?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what you're saying, it sort of makes me think of the gender piece of like sort of the social environment, the political, the environments in which people have to navigate, shape their behaviors, shape how they, some of the expectations you brought up, like caregiving, right? And expectations societally that we have for, women, in a sense that they must fulfill a caregiving role, right? And sort of these pieces that shape it. When Rachel was talking, I kept thinking, like, I would love to see the same type of study you're doing right now, but do it in 10 years with a whole new cohort, right? And really thinking about, do these patterns play out the same way, or is it truly the environment that's changed that has now shaped people? I think of when you were talking about the brain, I have just enough training in imaging to be dangerous. Like I kept thinking, I did a lot of work thinking about people's social engagement, right? And this idea of almost like cognitive stimulation, or use it or lose it, right? How do people maintain kind of brain function as they age? And we typically would see major differences. Again, we were probably the issue of measuring sex versus gender. And I just looked up a paper and I'm like, they're calling it gender, but I'm not sure if the Health ABC, how they actually define it in their study. So it could be problematic. But we saw differences in the types of social and leisure activities that people were doing, and the amount by gender, right? And so sort of these, I think of when I interview participants, even we talk about caregiving, but I remember many cisgender men would talk about how their wives were responsible for coordinating their social calendars.
Yeah.
Right? And sort of this piece of like, they're seen as the hub. And I wonder how that will shift over time. And as a lot of what we are capturing, these gender differences or gender role differences, right? And so we're actually capturing how your exposure to an environment over your life course shapes your physiology, right? It shapes your brain, it shapes your health, it shapes your exposure to stress and how you cope with that stress, right? And so we see, Rachel talked about women have not had the same educational and workforce opportunities in the cohorts we're studying right now. What will change when we study a new cohort that has had different opportunities? Will we find these sex differences, or will that help us to truly rule out this is a gender role? And I almost think like this is an environment issue. This is not biology, it's like a proxy for how biology has been shaped by the environment. And so that's where I think about this, and especially even thinking in my own work with LGBTQIA plus people, right? The big issue is the environment and how that has shaped health. We've looked at, for instance, and it would be interesting, Rachel, to compare, like, we think of like gender affirming hormone use, which is basically it's hormone replacement therapy, right? For people to affirm their gender identity. And there's one study that looked at sort of cognition and trans people in the Netherlands, I believe, or I think it was an Amsterdam study. I think it's Netherlands. But and they found, regardless of if you're having, taking testosterone or estrogen and progesterone, that you have a benefit to your cognition. They say we would expect maybe a negative effect on cognition for people getting testosterone, we thought. Right? That's sort of our thought. Nope. And so our thoughts around that are that being in a body, being in an environment that you can navigate as your true identity is more beneficial for health than the hormones in terms of how they impact the brain, right? And so it's a really it would be interesting to keep studying that. And that's why we need to keep doing this work to understand, is this biology or is this environment?
It's a lot of great points. I'm thinking about like studies across time and how I do get a feeling that my generation speaks a lot about those topics, and people, well, the sense that I get, like in Canada, maybe in another place is different, but is that we have more freedom to assume the identity that we want, which I saw in your recent paper that there's a lot of extra stress due to just like specifically not having the freedom to kind of assume the identity you want to assume, which would be great to see the difference. Just to redirect the conversation towards imaging a little bit, I just wanted to know if you think in any way that imaging is going to kind of contribute to the sex and gender research, and how maybe imaging can complement that type of research and maybe move it forward as well. I don't know if my question is clear.
As much as I love neuroimaging, I started out in neuropsychology, but I definitely would say that now I definitely focus a lot on neuroimaging. And I think that neuroimaging is a very powerful tool to try to measure things while people are alive. That's a very, very wonderful technique. But in terms of being able to really get at mechanism, I think that it is just one tool in our big tool set that we have available to us. But if we're trying to get to the bottom of, if we're talking about a biological effect versus a sociological effect versus an interplay between the two, which almost certainly there will be, neuroimaging could serve to sort of signpost what might be going on under the hood in the brain. But I think we will need a huge battery of other tools at our disposal. So chromosomal information, hormonal information, survey data, maybe even qualitative interviewing, whatever it might be, to get at all of the elements of the sex and gender component. But I don't personally think that neuroimaging is going to be the be-all and end-all of how we will get to the bottom of sex and gender differences in Alzheimer's disease risk in particular.
Do you have any opinion on that, Dr. Flatt?
I agree. I definitely have less expertise in imaging. If I were to answer, I was going to be like, it's a tool that helps to inform, right, sort of these pieces, but it doesn't, unfortunately, I think the question is so complex that we're going to need many different tools to help us answer this question. And I don't think one alone would really do justice. And so that's why we really need to have, as Rachel said, this interdisciplinary lens and like bringing this of our different skill sets, understanding, right? Can we look at life history? Can we look at, bring in sociologists that have a stronger understanding of even the historical perspective of how people's lives have changed, right? If you lived, grew up during a time when you were like thinking like World War II, right? How that might impact your trajectory versus, if you were born later, right? Or thinking about people that were born during like 9/11 and the shaping that has on people's health. It's not just, so I view it as like very complex. And so we need to pull tools from, many tools from our toolbox to kind of help answer this question.
Agreed. Because the thing you've got to be careful of is you don't want to slip into phrenology either. I think one of the things that the reason I mentioned that Stuart's work was a little controversial is not because of the study itself. The study was very clear and well done, but it brought up a lot of pain on Twitter. People were they hit out at it, and there were a lot of perspectives written on it, and how dare these researchers try to come up with a female brain and a male brain, and didn't we put this to bed decades ago? And you're just it does call to mind all the work that was done a long time ago about the genetics of intelligence, and you I think always need to understand that whatever you're doing is a proxy of, or that you're using a tool to try to measure something and make inferences about that. But I don't think that neuroimaging or machine learning methods will be able to give us feature classes that will best predict males and females or gender identity. And I think we should be very careful of what we're trying to do when we try to run models like that. And I guess that's all I'd sort of end by saying as well when we're thinking about neuroimaging in this space.
I think it's a very important point, and sometimes we forget about that, especially when it comes out to the general public, which is quite difficult sometimes, the interpretations that come out.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, I really feel like it shows the communication that needs to be done between general public and science itself with different fields, how we need to kind of talk to each other.
And just like that, we have reached the end of the first Cuban podcast. I hope you have learned as much as I did about the complex topic of sex and gender in research. On my end, I have learned that sex can be considered a dichotomous variable defined at birth, but it can also be much more than male or female. It can encompass reproductive health information, such as age at first menstruation and menopause. It can be about contraceptive intake, hormone levels, etc. Gender can be considered more of a dynamic concept that changes throughout one's life. And as Dr. Flatt mentioned, it is relevant to ask about both sex and gender across different generations, older and younger, because it can allow us to gain a more holistic image of the population we are studying. Lastly, Dr. Buckley gave us a little warning that neuroimaging tools are amazing to understand the impact of sex and gender on the brain, but it is just one tool in our large toolbox to understand the impact of sex and gender on people's brain health and health in general. So more collaborations are needed from different fields to understand sex and gender and their impact on people's health. Future research should focus on defining and standardizing sex and gender, given that there are no clear definitions for these concepts. Moreover, research should aim to be more representative so that people can feel included in research. Now, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave a comment and share. If you would like to be part of the podcast yourself because you also love science and want to share your topic with other people, email me at the email that I will leave on this page, and I hope to hear from you soon. See you!